Tonight we are breaking into a new chapter, chapter 12. So let me read to you there, starting with verse number 1. From the New International Version of the Bible, it says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these are all members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others." And I'm going to stop reading there. Probably should have stopped before I read that last verse, but this is where we're at this evening. As we get into the next segment of the book of Romans, we have gone through the early segment in which Paul was dealing with, for the most part, right up until chapter 8, it was all about just the doctrine of salvation. Jews were likely to have a perspective that was on the legalistic side. They were likely to have a perspective that attributed some kind of value to the work that they did, to the goodness that they endeavored to achieve, to their status as Jews. Whereas the Gentiles who were believers were not in such a boat and just were more or less considering themselves, it seems to me, glad to be saved. Paul wanted to address the gospel in a way that dealt with the problems that the Jews were having within themselves, the Gentiles were having within themselves, and in particular what caused them to be at odds with each other. And that's really the first 8 chapters. If you recall, we concluded that segment in that wonderful chapter, chapter 8. That's still, I think, beyond shadow of a doubt, the deepest single chapter in the entire Bible. There's more packed into Romans chapter 8 than than the rest of the Bible for the most part. I mean, it's just, as far as what it's talking about, what it means for a person of faith, just absolutely incredibly deep. And that kind of ended, that segment that had started with chapter 1 and worked up to chapter 8. And then we've been in a while dealing with chapters 9, 10, and 11, which were all wrapped up in the question of why are the elect not getting saved? And we finally came to the conclusion of that with the end of chapter 11. What we discovered there is that God hasn't given up on the Jews, and even though in the present time, and this goes the whole way back to the Apostle Paul, Jews were not getting saved, at least not many of them. There is going to come a day when God will be done doing the work that He's doing with the Gentiles. The full number of them will have come in, and then God will turn His attention back to the Jews. So that's chapters 9, 10, and 11. In chapter 12, right on now through chapter 15, so that's 12, 13, 14, and 15, the book of Romans in these sections looks pretty much like any other epistle, with the kind of subject matters that are addressed, with the way that those things get addressed. You could almost look at the book of Galatians or something in Colossians or something in Philippians and see, the thematic points will be very similar, the kinds of subject matters that are dealt with very similar. And so, really, when we get to chapter 12, we're kind of like in normalcy. We're talking about, normal aspects of just being a Christian and how to get that done, how to do that. And so, chapter 12 starts a segment that is, we'll title it, "How Should We Live in View of God's Mercy?" And this is not only for chapter 12, this is really right through the end of the book of Romans. It's all about that, which, as I said, puts it right in the pattern of the bulk of the rest of the Pauline epistles. So that's where we're at. We start with verse number 1 here in chapter 12, starting to deal with normal stuff. Stuff that isn't so geared into a conflict between Jews and Gentiles and their perspective on the work of God, nor historically the difference between God dealing with each of those groups. Now we're just talking about what it means to be a Christian, regardless of whether you're a Jew or you're a Gentile. All right, so he says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters. Now, the sisters part in the NIV is added in there for the sake of modern readers. It says brethren in the Greek. If that bothers you, it's just you have to understand the times in which this were written. That's just how society was addressed at that time. So he is saying something now. When he says he urges them, that word urge there is a word, believe it or not, it's the root of another word that we're all familiar with. In the book of John, the Holy Spirit is given a certain designation that you don't find in the other Gospels. Really, you don't find anywhere else in the Bible, really. It's focused on John's perspective. He calls it the Holy Spirit the Paraclete. That word Paraclete is a noun that comes out of this particular word, which is a verb, and it means to basically call one beside, or from beside to call to somebody. And the idea of it is that you could use it in the court of law, so that as you're standing before the judge, let's say some charges have been brought against you, you're standing there in court, you're in trouble, and your advocate, your paraclete, right, comes up beside you and speaks for you. Another way in which the word was used was just the kind of intensity or urgency that's possible when somebody is intimate to come along beside you and talk to you about some matter in your life. So, I mean, it has that kind of a range of meaning. It can go in those kinds of things. So when he says, I urge you, what he's basically saying is he's coming up close beside us in an intimate way, and is saying something to us very personally that we really need to hear. We've got to hear what he has to say on this subject matter. So that's how he starts off this foray into really normal kinds of matters. He says, I urge you, in view of God's mercy. Now, in view of God's mercy, you can see that I noted some of the things there. Therefore, then, is how he starts this off. Just says therefore in the NIV, but it's really, you see the little Greek word un there. That word has not just therefore, but it's talking about the repercussion of it. So if this is so, what must you do as a result? That kind of a flavor. So that's what he's talking about. So everything that's following that, therefore, in our English translations, is mostly going to be, as a result of something else, this is what you must do. Now, what is the result, or what is the thing that went before that leads to this result? It really goes back to verse number 32 in chapter 11, where he says, in that particular place, God has assigned all people to disobedience. Right? And he talked about the Jews, the Gentiles were disobedient, and the Jews had the revelation of God, and then the Jews became disobedient, and God gave revelation and mercy to the Gentiles. And then at the end of time, right, he's going to turn back and give mercy to the Jews. And he says that this is because God has assigned everyone, or consigned everyone, to disobedience, so he can have mercy on all. So regardless of who you are or where you came from, whether you're a Jew or you're a Gentile, in the end of time, everyone's going to stand before God, and as they do, if they stand successfully before God, it will be the same for everyone. They'll do it because of mercy. It won't be because they earned it. It won't be because they merited it. It won't be anything about their personal qualities at all that allows them to successfully stand in the presence of God, it will be because of God's mercy. And so this was the plan of God, that there would be no first and second class citizens in his realm, but as he's dealing with human beings, we're all in the same lot. We're all the same creatures, really. It doesn't matter where you came from, whether it was Jew or Gentile. Everything is going to depend on God's mercy. So because that is so, what follows from that? What comes out? Because we are all debtors to the mercy of God, this is what comes out. So, when we talk about in view of God's mercy, that's really what's being said there. It's not just a mental asset, it's almost like a logical necessity. Because there is this quality of mercy that God has toward humankind. Because that is so, this comes out. It's not, it's not just, like I said, it's not just a slight concept that can be applied to it descriptively. It's something that is logically almost necessitated. So I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, or out of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, he literally means a living sacrifice. Now, that's kind of a weird concept, because sacrifices are not alive. Sacrifices come alive, but they don't stay alive. And if they stay alive, then you really don't have a sacrifice. That was the whole idea of a sacrifice, is that something gave up the very quality of life in some kind of a vicarious fashion, generally speaking, and that appease whatever God someone might be sacrificing to. And certainly that was true of Old Testament sacrifices. Sacrifices came alive into the temple. The priest took those sacrifices and killed them, and in the killing of those sacrifices in some sense stood for the guilt or the sin or the fellowship that, the relationship that a sacrificer had with God. So it always is the case that a sacrifice has to die, or it's not really a sacrifice. He says, offer yourself as a living sacrifice. So what does he mean by that? Well, that kind of goes back to Romans chapter 5 and 6, does it not? Remember we talked back then about this word identity. We said that what Paul was teaching is that by faith we can so identify with Christ that we can, in a matter of speaking, see ourselves on the cross with Christ, see ourselves in the grave with Christ, see ourselves coming out of the grave into the newness of life with Christ. We can see even ourselves seated in heavenly places with Christ. That's not in Romans, but I mean it's, so the whole ability of a believer to, by faith, identify themselves, to connect themselves with a sense of commitment and dependency on Christ, brings out all of these features. What Christ did, we do. What Christ experienced, we experience. Where Christ is, we are. That kind of a thing. And so, when you think about what this is getting to as far as offering ourselves as a living sacrifice, it's really getting to the place where we don't have to die to be identified with Christ. And in the same situation, in a slightly different expression here, we can be a living sacrifice because we can identify ourselves with Christ on the cross, and in the tomb, Christ was the sacrifice. We can be a sacrifice, and even though Christ suffered death, we don't have to suffer death to have the Holy Spirit. We don't have to suffer death to have the resurrection Spirit. And that's what Paul was developing all through chapter 5 and 6, as I said, is that identification by faith is what opens up the opportunity for us to experience it without really having to experience it. We can die to ourselves without actually having to die. We can come to new life with Christ without actually having to be buried. Right? We can step out into the newness of life without actually having to be resurrected. And so this is the quality that now comes to this place, spoken earlier in the book of Romans. Now it comes back a little bit later on, and it's put in this nice compact expression, a living sacrifice. This is what we are to offer ourselves. It is our identification with Christ in faith, or by faith, brings us to this place where we can be this living sacrifice. Now, I show up here some purple stuff, and that's a little bit of an aside, but it's worth talking about at least momentarily, mainly because if there's areas of theology that are important, it's always good to stop and visit those for something, or for a little while. There is a school of thought in Christianity. It's not a new one. It goes back to ancient times, really, and it's been part of the kinds of things that the doctors of the church have written about throughout the ages, trying to get a handle on the attributes of God. You know, and when we say attributes of God, what we're just basically saying is what we think are the true statements about the nature of what God is and who God is. One of these claims that has, as I said, been going through, since the ancient times up to our day, is the thought that God is impassible. How many of you have ever heard that said or come upon that in a book? God is impassible. Maybe in a footnote in a study Bible. Well, we'll all learn something new together then tonight. Impassible doesn't mean, it's not like two yellow lines on the highway. That's impassable. This is impassible. A little, difference between an A and an I is all it is. But what impassible means is that a person who would be impassible is a person who doesn't feel, is a person who can't suffer. And there was a thinking amongst the scholastic theologians in the past that for God to be perfect, He has to be unchanging. If God is perfect and unchanging, then He can't even do something as simple as change states of mind. Because a change in the state of mind in this kind of thinking would imply that one state was not as perfect as another. Which is just kind of silly if you think about it. I mean, is it possible to go from one perfect state to another perfect state? I don't have any problem at all visualizing that, right? Is it possible for a thing to be perfectly what it is, and for that thing to then be in another state and be perfectly what it is there? And I think that's what we have with God. If this kind of doctrine is taken too far, and you probably have to read a dusty theological book to see this kind of thing, but if you take this statement too far, you end up having a God who's not moved by anything, a God who has no emotion, a God who is not touched by anything. And I think, how in the world could anyone read the Bible and come up with a theological formula that would have God being impassible? I don't know, boggles my mind how those two things can possibly go together. It's almost like, somebody isn't letting the Word of God be the authority, but is letting some kind of a systematic approach to logic be their authority. And here's the thing about logic is that we think that we understand it, and when we do, we can say that it demonstrates a certain degree of perfection. I mean, A plus B equals C, right? And if that is so, then certain other things follow, and then you can get to the, D plus E equals, you can follow stage by stage. Things are necessitated logically. As you step through these things, they are necessary. They're all obligated to be, so to speak. That kind of thinking applied to God gets you into problems, mainly because it is something that is founded down at our level. And when it comes to God, God is not subject to our thoughts about Him. God is who He is, and He reveals Himself to us. So if God says about Himself, "This is the way I am," even if all the structures of your logic can't understand that, even if all the structures, well, God's perfect, then this must be so, and if that's so, then this must be so, and if that's so, then this must be so. And you can build a train, a long, long train, and you can think you have a perfect statement that is absolutely necessitated logically, and therefore must be true. And then you get a statement from God who says what? That he's hurt, or that he regrets, that he rues, that he is joyful, that he's angry, and it blows it all up. In the realm of impassibility, that is. So we just have too many clear statements from the Scriptures that tell us that God feels, that God is moved. Things move him. He's not static. He's not always the same in that aspect of his being. He's always the same as far as his truth and his justice, his character. I mean, he's always the same in those aspects of himself that make up himself. But as far as does God have the ability to move from one state of emotion to another? I would say the Scriptures clearly say that he does. And so even if we don't have a logical structure to make that so, then we have to give up on the logical structure and go with the word of revelation. Because when it comes to God, there's only one true source that we have for understanding him, and that's what he tells us about himself. That's it. I mean, if we understood what we studied back in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2 about the depravity of mankind, we realize in our natural selves we can't know God. In our natural selves, we're not going to figure out our way to God. In our natural human abilities or inabilities, we're just not going to break through the veil. So the only way that we're ever going to know God or understand God is when he steps on and says, "Here I am." Deal with it. That's it. That's the only way that we can understand and get cleared up on it. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time. It sounds like none of you have been tripping through any dusty old theological books and have run into the awful notion of impassibility. You'll probably go home tonight and Google it, or Wikipedia it, or something of that nature, in which case you'll find a long history of supposedly great-minded theologians who have espoused this kind of concept of God, and it's just the worst thing in the world. I can't imagine somebody carrying around this thought. Is it any wonder that those who do don't have any relationship with God, any warmth, any sense of presence? It's like you can't have presence if you refuse to let God be who he is. It's just not going to work out. God is never going to stay inside of the straitjackets that we try to put him in. It's just never going to work. So you got to just let God be God, and what that means is sometimes he's angry, and that's really scary. And sometimes he's disappointed, and that's really scary. And sometimes he is wonderfully joyous, and that's really wonderful. Right? But we just have got to let God be God and accept those kinds of things. Otherwise, we just can't have the kind of relationship that we're meant to have with him. Relationship is the wrong word to describe what a lot of theologians through the history of the church have had with God. They've had musings about God. They've made up theories about God. They developed hypotheses concerning the motivations of God, but they haven't known God. And yet the simple-minded who are willing to let God be God often stumble into something very deep and rich in their personal interaction with God. And if there's any lesson there, it's hopefully one that we can all embrace. So God feels at his level. So impassibility is not true. And what I mean by that, God feels at his level. God is perfect. So we're not, we can't have God drifting through less perfect states and more perfect states. That thinking is not a proper way to perceive God. But I think what we have to see is that when he's angry, he's perfectly angry. When he's joyous, he's perfectly joyous. Right? When he's disappointed, he's perfectly disappointed. If you can see it kind of in that kind of a light, I think that we understand, God feels at his level. And we feel at a level that is analogous. So this is what it means to be made in the image of God, right? What he is, we are the analog to. Right? We are the analog to. So if God is a certain way, then we are the shadow cast by that reality. And if we are happy and we are sad, we are disappointed, we have all of these various states of mind that we can have, those are all possible, it seems to me, because we are a reflection of the person of God. So, I think I probably said enough about that, so I'll move on because it's not necessary to dig into that to get to the text. So, we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, alive but given up. A couple qualifiers he gives here. He says that this is holy, and that word, we all, I think, understand what holy means. This is really, Paul's a Jew, and this is really a throwback to the Old Testament concept of sacrifices. In the Old Testament, the sacrificial system was very demanding. It was very demanding and very precise, to tell you the truth. Only certain animals could be used as a sacrifice. And they had to be in certain conditions. They had to be a certain gender, for the most part. There were some sacrifices could be females, but for the most part, they were male. And they had to be completely healthy. You start getting to all of these various kinds of descriptive matters concerning the sacrifices in the Old Testament. You see that they were very much subject to quality control. Perhaps we could put it that way. And in some respects, holiness, or the concept of holiness, is an understanding of quality. Now, the word itself, at its root, really deals with something being separate. And there's a couple of ways that you can look at that notion of separateness. When it comes to God, I love the concept of holiness with God because it means that he's other than. Right? When I think about God, even though we are a reflection of God, God's not like me. I'm like God in some kind of a shadowy way, but the beauty of the original is unlike me. It's totally different. His thoughts are not my thoughts. His ways are not my ways. That speaks to holiness. God dwells in unapproachable light, the scriptures say. And so, we have this quality of holiness in God. When we talk about holiness in, let's say, a prophet or a priest, some of the figures that we have, particularly through the Bible history, what does holiness there mean? Well, I think the concept of separation there, or being separate there, means that they were dedicated. Right? This is what they spent their life's energy, because that's all any of us have, is what life energy that we have, our breathing, our respiring, our movement, our actions, all the things that we do, our life's energy. When a person was a prophet of God, when a person was a priest of God, they had like a dibs on their being from God. And so they were holy in that respect, right? So a priest was holy, a prophet was holy in the sense that they were separated unto the service of God. God is separated in the sense that he is other than everything. He's other than everything that we can see, because God's not corporeal. He's not part of the actual substance of the universe. He created it, but he's not it. And so we have separation there. And then when we talk about, the kind of notion that the Bible in the New Testament would have for holiness for you and me and for all of us other schlubs would be that we are separate from what? The world. That we're separate from the world. That is a really hard concept, I think, for us to deal with. Because, it sounds so much like that it wouldn't be fun. Right? Because when you're separate from the world, what are you saying? That are we supposed to go live in a little cloistered community, or are we supposed to all dress really different? Are we supposed to eat different things? I mean, all of these kinds of notions have in some sense been part of either things in the Bible or things that have been practiced by people who felt some kind of call to holiness or separateness. Is that what it means? No, it just means that you're in the world, but you're not of the world. You're in the world, but you don't think like the world thinks. You don't see things like the world sees things. You don't value things like the world values things. And you treat people differently than the world treats people. There's a number of other things that you could throw in there as well. But this is holiness as just, all of us. So all of these kinds of qualities go into holiness. And so when he says that we are to see ourselves as a living sacrifice, identified with Christ on the cross so much that even though we don't have to actually die on the cross, we actually die to our old self, to our old selfish perspective, and the life that we live after that identification, we live by the power of the Son of God who died for us, who gave us His Spirit. We live out of that power a life that is distinct from the way the world does it. Show me Christians that are not distinguishable from the world around you, and I will show you somebody who has not broken through to understand what Romans chapter 5 and chapter 6 mean. Right? Dead to self, alive to God, dead to the old man, alive through the Spirit. Right? Dead with Christ on the cross, alive in the Spirit, in the resurrection. And we haven't broken through if there's nothing distinguishing. Now, we don't want to get artificial about that. I think that's been a temptation in the past. Even with the Assemblies of God, it was a temptation for us, because most of the early Assemblies of God people came out of the holiness movement in one way or another, and so their notions were that, my great aunt Jenny. We always call her Jenny, but her name was actually Jane. My great aunt Jenny, she was the sweetest person you ever want to meet. But she always had a little white collar thingy and buttoned up right to the top, long dress, and her hair was always on top of her head. And you didn't know this unless you stayed overnight at her house, that when she let it out to sleep at night, it was down to the floor. She never cut it. Right? Because that's just the way they read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, right? That a woman was not to cut her hair. And so, no makeup. She didn't cut her hair. Right? She had her dress up to here, and it was always long. And we weren't allowed to play cards in her house. There was no card playing in her house. So, you can think, well, what did you do when you went to see Aunt Jenny? I'll tell you, we went to bed early. We went to bed early. You went to bed early and hoped that you didn't have to get up at night because you didn't have indoor plumbing, and it was a chamber pot if you could bear it, or it was a scary trek out to the outhouse. So but she was just as sweet a person as you would ever seen in your life. But all of those notions that she was practicing, she did it for the sake of holiness. Were they necessary? Not really. I mean, she was convicted that way, so there's no sense in making life miserable for her or arguing with her about it or anything else like that. But at the same point in time, I think that sometimes we think that in terms of holiness, because we know that it's something we should be embracing, something we should be walking in. Sometimes we say, well, give me a clue, give me something so that I know that I'm doing it. And, God says, well, just love people. Oh, come on, you got to have more than that. Be a person who doesn't tread hardly on anyone around you. It's like, oh, come on, give me something more. You get all these nebulous things about what it means to be a loving person, or a kind person, or a patient person, and all of those things are, we're human beings, and most of those things really don't come all that naturally to us. And so, trying to be holy, we just need, give me something that I know that if I do that, I'm holy. Right? I didn't cut my hair, oh man, I'm holy. I didn't smoke any cigarettes, I'm holy. Whatever it might be, we just sometimes want mile markers. And, that's really not the way the Bible teaches us about holiness. The Bible says, here's Jesus, this is what holiness looks like. Do likewise. It's like, let's face it, Jesus is very foreign to us. Thinking like Jesus thinks, man, that's trippy. And it's really hard to do that. I mean, he was somebody who talked about being kind to his enemies. He didn't just talk about it, he went to the cross. I mean, the very people that killed him on the cross, he was dying for them as they were killing him. And he did so out of love for them. And there's, we don't know. I mean, you could watch The Robe or some other things that are fictional. I mean, we really don't have any clue or idea about what impact his death might have had on them. But nonetheless, I guess the point that I'm making is just this. Jesus is this standard of what holiness looks like. And it's something that is alien to us as human beings. It's something that's really out of our wheelhouse. And there's no shortcuts to it, and there's no little mile markers along the way that, if you're doing this, then you're on the way. I've achieved something. It's just, you're saved by grace. God loved you the way that he found you. He'll love you the way that you end up. And in the meantime, you just put yourself in his hand and trust him and do your best to embrace a different perspective of things through faith. Okay? So we're to be living sacrifices, holy and fully acceptable. Now the fully acceptable part throws us off because we're not Jewish mostly in our thinking. A Jewish person would read that and understand exactly what Paul's talking about. Remember I said how demanding the quality assurance was on sacrifices in the Old Testament? That's what this is talking about. If an animal wasn't exactly along the lines of what was called for in the Bible, it was not an acceptable sacrifice. So when it says fully acceptable, this is what it's saying is that if we are a living sacrifice, holy and completely given up to the standard of God, this is a life lesson, I think, for all young believers to somehow or another get through, and sometimes I think it's difficult, especially if you come into a church environment after you get saved that doesn't systematically endeavor to try to disciple you. Some folks don't like the idea of systematic discipleship. I stumbled into it. I got saved over Thanksgiving break my junior year of college. And so when I came back to college at the end of Thanksgiving break, I didn't quite know what to do with this thing that had happened to me. But my best friend from home, believe it or not, we've known each other since the 5th grade. And we happened to go to Penn State. Both of us go to Penn State. I did all my stuff earlier than he did. So I've gotten accepted and sent in things. He said, well, how did you fill it out? And I said, well, I filled it out this way. He said, I'm going to do that too. He ended up being my next door neighbor my freshman year in college. But even though we had all that history, right, my freshman year in college, I went, I took a left turn, and he ended up getting saved. He ended up getting a right turn, maybe we could say. And so we kind of, drifted into, separate kinds of lives and lifestyles. And then when I came back from getting saved over Thanksgiving break, the only person I knew up in college that might understand what I was saying at that point in time and maybe could help me was Tim. So I called him up and I said, "Hey Tim, it's Steve." He said, "Steve, haven't heard from you in a while." I said, "Hey," I said, "something happened over Thanksgiving break. I got saved and I heard a yip. And now we only had 7-foot ceilings in our dorm spaces at that time. And there was a concrete ceiling there. And Tim jumped so high he hit his head on the ceiling. And he came back down and we started the conversation up again. And I said, "Are you still going to church?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "You don't mind if I tag along with you, do you, on Sunday?" He said, No, yeah, you can come, I'll pick you up." And so he picked me up and he says to me, one thing though, he says, "It's an Assembly of God church." And I didn't know an Assembly of God from Adam, what was that? I didn't know. I could have been going into a cult for all I knew. So he came and picked me up on Sunday and off we went to that Assembly of God church. And of course, as they say, the rest is history. But, it's a remarkable thing to realize that when we are coming into Christ, we are coming into this relationship with God that is brand new to us, totally foreign to us, and yet we are called into a life of holiness to be fully acceptable to the Lord. And it just requires a launching out into a totally different way to go about living. And what happened to me at college after that is I ended up getting involved, stumbled into something else called Campus Crusade for Christ. And the thing about Campus Crusade for Christ that was so helpful to me as a young disciple, as a young convert to Christ, was that they really believed in systematic discipleship training. And they actually broke it down into almost like courses. If you're at college, right, everything's in 101 and 201s and 301s and all that kind of stuff. And so they had their steps broken down in that kind of way. And you went in and you looked at a bunch of scriptures and you discussed it, talked about it and whatnot. And when you worked through one thing, then you went on to the other, got you into a small group where someone could ask you, "How you doing? How's things going for you? How's your prayer life going?" That kind of thing. How's your scripture reading going? And they were, nothing really judgmental or anything else like that. Just somebody was there to try to help you, along the line. And I say all that to say this: in a lot of cases, people come to Christ in the church world are not subject to those kinds of things. And when you're not subject to those kinds of things, it's really difficult to take on a different nature, because it really is alien to your natural self to walk in the way that is a holy and fully acceptable sacrifice to God. And it really does help people is if they can go through I don't want to say a training, but a discipling kind of process early in their days that kind of helps them understand what it is that they've adopted by faith. When you don't have those kinds of things, often you get Christian people that have been in the church for a while, and they some of the things they say shock you, some of the things they do shock you, some of the things they chase after, or some of the things they value shock you, and you think, well, how in the world can somebody love Christ and have those things in their life? And I think, well, it's pretty easy to have those kinds of things in your life if you haven't gone through the cross and started a process where you understand what it means to live a life where you shut the door on something in the past, your old life, and then you've opened the door and you've stepped into a new life with Christ and the Holy Spirit. And it really does pay, it seems to me, to have those kinds of things. If it's not in a formal kind of a thing, it helps to have a mentor. It helps to have somebody that, kind of takes you under their wing and says, how you doing? How's the Bible reading going? How's your prayer life going? How's your interaction with people going? Just because though that kind of thing can help in this particular area, we're just called to something. I mean, it's just not about saying a prayer and getting saved. It really isn't. Say a prayer and you're set for eternity. And that's really not what it's all about. It's really about getting saved from what you were and being brought into something you never could have imagined. And it helps if somebody is there to kind of lean on while you're getting it all started. I think a lot of folks have different perspectives, but here's the thing about holiness is that it's a word that means separate, different, other than. That's a pretty strong word. Probably doesn't get used enough. When you think about fully acceptable, that seems like, there's such a move to saying against standards. Oh, don't demand something of me that's, that seems like a pretty demanding word to me, fully acceptable. And then living sacrifice, that's like over the top. Die to myself? That is just, that is totally at odds with the whole me generation and what gets purported in our psychologized world, where we're all, we think Maslow was right, we're all trying to make a trek to self-actualization. No, we're trying to meet God and know that we've met Him, and having met Him, to know that we've befriended Him. That's it, right? That's what it's about, is meet God, and having met Him, know that you know Him, that you're a friend to Him. And we're failing in so many ways, it seems to me, when we don't. It's not hellfire and brimstone. That's not that just gets people afraid. Not that a little fear every now and again isn't helpful in some way, but it's the vision. What's the vision behind it? Sit in a church and feel good about sitting in a church, or looking at your neighbor and thinking, as long as I'm one notch above 90%, Mr. 90% living next door to me, as long as I'm one notch above that, I'm good to go. It's like, no, it's nothing but God will do. And knowing God, knowing He's my friend, that's it. That seems to me like that's a pretty good vision. That's a pretty good target for folks to pursue after. And if they do, if that becomes the passion of their hearts, they're going to do really well. And they're going to do really well. I don't mean in the world, but they're going to do really well from an eternal perspective. They're going